Some of the most dangerous places don't look dangerous at all. They look like home. They sound like laughter through walls, like familiar voices, like footsteps you trust enough not to question. They are the spaces where routine settles in, where days repeat, where the idea of safety is assumed rather than checked. And it's in those places where vigilance softens and assumption takes over, that harm can hide the longest. Welcome to If These Trees Could Talk.
We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are recording today, the Wonnarua people. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where this story takes place, the Giimwi Wallabara Yidinji people, and pay our respects to all elders past and present and recognise their ongoing connection to land, culture and community.
Somewhere, a child was actively being harmed. This was deliberate, repeated harm, documented relentlessly. This case shows a stark difference between power used for ego and politics and power when it's used for its true purpose. This just makes me so angry.
Are you okay?
I can't answer that. Today we are heading north, right up to Cairns, a place most people picture bathed in sunlight and humidity, a bit like we're experiencing here today.
It's very hot today.
It is very hot. Where the rainforest presses in close and the reef shimmers just offshore and life moves at an unhurried tropical pace. It's a city known for holidays, backpackers, barefoot afternoons and postcard beauty. But like so many places we cover in our episodes, Cairns also holds a story that does not quite fit the brochure. Because tucked away behind the palms and the quiet suburban streets is where one family once lived, appearing ordinary, even loving, and where a case began that would eventually unravel across continents, expose one of the most disturbing exploitation networks ever uncovered, and show what can happen when police forces around the world refuse to look away. Before we go any further...
Trigger warning.
Trigger warning. This episode contains discussions of child sexual abuse, exploitation, grooming and trafficking. Listener discretion is strongly advised, and if this topic is too much, please feel free to step away. Except you, Megan. You're not allowed to. You have to sit with me through this because I don't know if I'll get through it on my own.
She's tearing up already, everybody.
Yeah.
It's not. Okay.
This is a case that I've wanted to do since we started this podcast, and I have hesitated clearly for just as long. The content is confronting, it's genuinely horrific, and it matters how it's told. And I've also sat with another real concern about how this story could be misread. So I just want to be really clear before we start that reporting on these perpetrators in no way reflects my personal views around same-sex parents. The men in today's story are not loving parents. They are pedophiles who groomed not only a child in their care, but an entire community that trusted them. I'm choosing to tell this story now because of what's currently filling our media. Conversations around the Epstein files, ICE, the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi. I could go on and on, but I'm not going to. because this case shows a stark difference between power used for ego and politics and power when it's used for its true purpose. When institutions like these are aligned, accountable, and focused on protecting the vulnerable people within our communities, they can create real, measurable change and protection for victims. And this case proves how that is done. That's my only political rant, I promise. Before we dive in, I think it's important to centre the person who matters most in this story, the child. His real name has never been publicly released, and that decision was made to protect him. In a Four Corners investigation that aired in March 2014, the child is given the name Adam, a deliberate choice to humanise him while preserving his privacy. And I'm going to be doing the same thing today. Not to create distance, but to give him dignity, to remind ourselves that this isn't just a case file or a timeline. It's the story of a real child who deserves safety, care, and protection. Peter Truong and Mark Newton were very deliberate in the way they presented themselves to the world. In photos and interviews, they styled their lives as open, wholesome, and aspirational. Outdoorsy types with cameras slung up over their shoulders, self-employed creatives living in a quiet, sun-soaked life in far north Queensland. In 2005, they spoke publicly about the joy of becoming parents, even sitting down with the ABC in an interview to share what they framed as a hopeful story of persistence and love. "We are gay dads," they explained. And they told the host and listeners how Adam had come into their lives through a surrogate mother in Russia, that artificial insemination had worked quickly, and that Mark was Adam's biological father. It was a story that neatly fit into the narrative that they were selling. Modern parents, honesty, transparency, and even pride. But it wasn't true. None of it was. Mark Newton was not Adam's biological father. Adam wasn't the result of a surrogacy arrangement. He was a baby they had purchased for $8,000 from a Russian unwanted pregnancy. That child was reduced to a transaction. His birth papers were falsified to support the lie, and at the time no one had any immediate reason to doubt them. On paper, everything appeared legitimate. Web designers, photographers, stable, settled, respectable parents. And that was the point. That's what Truong and Newton were really selling. It wasn't the picture of a family, it was trust. And for a long time that trust held. But what was happening to Adam did not occur in isolated moments. It was imposed on him as a way of life. From the time he was just 20 months old, the first recorded abuse began. Before he had language, before memory could fully form, before he had any capacity to understand what resistance was. There was no safe reference point, no earlier experiences to measure against what was being done to him. Cameras were always present. Filming was constant. Adam was taught through repetition and control that being watched was unavoidable. The same lens captured everyday moments and acts of harm, deliberately collapsing any separation between the two. His world was engineered so that there was no clear boundaries, no protected spaces, and no moments that truly belonged to him. The adults responsible for his care trained him into compliance. Authority was absolute. Silence was enforced and his reactions were shaped until resistance faded. Not because he accepted what was happening, but because survival demanded it. Trust was manipulated and weaponised, binding harm to dependency in a way a child could not untangle. As Adam grew, his autonomy was systematically stripped away. His body, his movements, and his presence were controlled. Home was not a place of safety. It was a managed environment where every aspect of his life was monitored and directed. By the time he was 4 years old, the conditioning was deeply embedded and choice had long since been removed from his world. Behind closed doors, this was not chaos or loss of control. It was deliberate, repeated and structured. A childhood shaped by coercion and surveillance, where innocence was exploited and recorded, and where a child's humanity was treated as something to be used rather than protected. What was happening to Adam did not exist in isolation. He was not harmed for secrecy alone. He was harmed for access. Peter Truong and Mark Newton were part of a wider, deeply entrenched international network of offenders who referred to themselves as the Man-Boy-Love Network. A name so calculated and euphemistic it attempts to sanitise something that is, in reality, nothing but the organised sexual abuse of children. Within this network, Adam was treated as currency. His presence, his ability, his enforced compliance gave Truong and Newton status. They were not on the margins of this community. They were admired. Their ability to move a child across borders, to maintain control, to evade scrutiny, and to repeatedly expose him to others elevated them within a system built entirely on exploitation. This was not desire acting alone. This was structure and collaboration. Adam's life expanded outwards, not into safety but into circulation. Travel became routine. Airports, hotel rooms, unfamiliar adults. All orchestrated by the people meant to protect him. Each encounter reinforced the same lesson: his body was not his own, and adults could decide what happened to it. The network relied on obedience, silence and isolation, and Adam was taught all three before he was old enough to understand words like danger or choice. There's no neutral language for this, no reframing that softens the truth. What this network did, and what Truong and Newton facilitated, was the systematic trafficking of a child for sexual abuse. The name they gave themselves does not make it less violent. It makes it more revealing because it shows intent. It shows the ideology and it shows how deeply dehumanised Adam had become within their world. But this is where our story is going to turn. And you can take a little deep breath. Because networks like these do not collapse on their own. They don't dissolve through shame. They only end when they are confronted, exposed and dismantled piece by people willing to follow the trail, no matter how disturbing it becomes.
Are you okay?
I can't answer that. I can't answer it. This just makes me so angry, and the fact that there are victims currently being treated the way that they are in the world infuriates me. I wanted to share this story to show you how different it can be when people make the choice to do the right thing.
You obviously do a lot of research, a lot of time goes into one of these episodes, and you said you've been thinking about this for years. Why do you put yourself into this position?
Because it matters.
That's probably why I'm still sitting here.
Yeah. We don't live in a safe world. I think constantly about the victims currently I know my algorithm's different to yours, but I can't open social media at the moment without seeing something about the Epstein files or some new thing that's come out or some rich, privileged fucking asshole who's making claims of, oh, I wasn't there, or no, I don't remember that, when there's fucking photos of them doing it. I can't imagine how that feels for the people who were violated by them. And if it makes me feel like this, I literally cannot comprehend what their lives must be like at the moment. This story, Adam's story, happened at a time when the US was still, and you'll understand where the US comes into it, was still under the Obama administration. This network was brought down by ICE and the Department of Justice. And when we look at what those two agencies are currently doing at the moment, it's just worlds apart. So I've had this, and there's many reasons why I haven't shared this story, mostly because I didn't know if I was going to be able to make my way through it. But I think the world needs a comparison right now of what this could look like compared to what it does. And that's why I put myself through it.
This is something you can do.
This is my part.
Yeah.
Yeah. The first crack didn't come from Australia. It came quietly across the Tasman in Wellington, New Zealand. In August 2011, an inspector named John Peacock from New Zealand's Department of Internal Affairs was executing a raid on the home of a suspected child sex offender, a 33-year-old man named Craig Broadley. What police found initially was grim but familiar, a hard drive containing close to 100 files of child abuse material. But it was what sat alongside those files that stopped Peacock in his tracks. Tucked away in private folders were dozens upon dozens of images of the same young boy. Not random, not incidental, carefully composed. The boy was posed deliberately, photographed again and again, the camera's attention lingering a little bit too long. Some of the images were taken in public spaces, one set on a hill overlooking Wellington Airport. There was nothing candid about them. The poses were contrived, the eye contact was direct, and the child had been arranged and directed. As Peacock and his colleagues scrolled through these files, the unease grew. Individually, the images didn't meet the legal threshold to be classified as illegal or pornography, but together they told a very different story. The sheer volume, the fixation on one single child, the way the photos shifted gradually in tone, this wasn't accidental and it wasn't innocent. What troubled Peacock most wasn't what was visible, it was what wasn't. Who was behind the camera? Who was directing the child? And did the adults responsible for him know that these images existed at all? The photographs raised questions that would become central to everything that followed. What else was happening when the camera wasn't clicking? Among the material seized from Craig Broadley's were home videos showing the same child travelling with multiple men. In one, they move through underground caves, a young boy with adults who guide him, praise him and direct him. On the surface, it looks just like an adventure. Exploration, travel and shared experiences. But to Inspector John Peacock, these weren't harmless holiday memories. They showed proximity, access, familiarity. A child embedded in adult spaces where he did not belong. One detail in that video changed everything. A single frame as the group climbed back into a car. A Queensland number plate flashed past the camera. It was enough. Peacock froze the image and sent it to his counterparts in Australia. Within hours, New Zealand and Queensland police were working together. Australian authorities ran the checks, full names, dates of births, backgrounds. There was no criminal history. On paper, everything looked clean, and that in itself was unsettling. As Peacock continued digging in Wellington, the case shifted again, this time not through images but words. Skype chat logs. Thousands of lines of conversation between men who spoke openly and casually about children as commodities. Names surface repeatedly. Peter and Mark. Language that removed all doubt about what was happening. This wasn't fantasy, it was coordination, planning, discussions of travel, of access, of exchanges, a child being moved between adults for abuse. What Peacock had stumbled into was not just offending, it was trafficking. A network operating across borders, meeting face-to-face, sharing children, documenting it and believing themselves untouchable. For investigators used to seeing this kind of abuse contained to screens and devices, this was something else entirely. The moment it became clear that Adam was being transported internationally for harm, the urgency shifted. This was no longer about gathering evidence, it was about time. Australian police moved immediately to establish where Peter Truong and Mark Newton were, and the answer landed hard. They had already left the country. Another overseas trip, Adam with them. This time, the destination was the United States. What Australian and New Zealand police didn't yet know was that at the very same time on the other side of the world, another investigation was quietly unfolding that would soon collide with their own. In August 2011, Inspector Brian Bone from the United States Postal Inspection Service was working a separate case out of Washington, D.C. His investigation began with one man, 39-year-old Idaho resident named Don Casper, a member of a highly secretive online chat group. Casper lived an unremarkable life in a neat suburban house, but inside that house, investigators found something deliberately hidden. It wasn't on a computer, and it wasn't on his desk. It was concealed in a crawl space. A spindle of DVDs tucked away where no one would casually look. What was recorded on them was unthinkable. Children being sexually abused. Casper hadn't collected this material. He had filmed the abuse himself and shared it within a closed online group known as Tail of the Dragon. For more than 2 decades, Tail of the Dragon had operated in the shadows. Members across the world traded millions of images and videos, producing their own material and protecting themselves behind layers of encryption and security software. This wasn't a loose collection of offenders, it was a self-built system. Its members monitored law enforcement activity, shared counter-surveillance techniques, and warned one another about investigations. They also believed they were untouchable. As Brian Bone and his team began peeling back the layers, aliases started turning into real people. One of the first identified was Casper himself. Then others followed. Among them was an Australian user operating under the name Red Rover. That name led directly to Peter Truong. Bones' investigation spread outwards, from screen names to addresses to chat logs to homes. In Indiana, federal investigators identified a long-term member of Tail of the Dragon using the alias Taz Blunt. His real name was Thomas Vaughan, 44 years old, unemployed, living with his parents in a quiet suburb north of Indianapolis. Inside his house, forensic teams uncovered thousands of meticulously organised folders of abuse material. One folder, however, stood out. Inside, there were freeze-frame images taken from videos. They showed an adult man and a very young child, around 4 or 5 years old. Faces were cropped out, identities unknown, but the child's age was immediately alarming. This wasn't historical material, it was recent. Somewhere, a child was actively being harmed. As investigators traced the source of that folder, another alias emerged, the Beeve. That identity led to a high-profile Florida attorney named John Rex Powell. Another man appeared in the same material, Jason Beto, a junior tennis coach from Michigan. Law enforcement now had perpetrators. What they didn't have was the most important thing of all. They didn't know who the child was. To find him, Bones' team tucked back into the images themselves. They scrutinised every frame, every detail, searching for something. Can you imagine what that job would be like? So they desperately looked for something that could identify the boy. 2 features stood out: a henna tattoo on his chest and a small mole on his stomach. Those details would become critical. Because once investigators realised they were looking at a very young, unidentified child being actively trafficked and abused across borders, the urgency changed completely. This was no longer about dismantling an online group. It was about finding a child, fast, before he disappeared entirely. Back in Australia, none of this was visible yet. Task Force Argos had no idea at the very same moment investigators in the US were chasing the same shadows. What they did have was intelligence from New Zealand, the chat logs, the modelling photographs, the growing certainty that something was deeply wrong. And on a wet Cairns morning, that was enough. Detective Ian Wells and his team arrived with a search warrant at the home of Peter Truong and Mark Newton. The men were overseas, but their house wasn't dormant. It was alive, humming, cameras everywhere, servers running, a system designed so they could watch, monitor and control from anywhere in the world. Police spoke briefly with the neighbours, warning them not to answer calls or respond to messages from Peter or Mark. Moments later, the phones rang anyway. Truong was calling from overseas. His voice panicked. He couldn't reach his computers. He couldn't access the internet. Whatever was happening inside of his home was suddenly outside of his control. Inside, investigators began uncovering the mechanics of the life Truong and Newton had built. Cameras, travel books, Adam's passport, already full by the time he was 3 years old. Evidence of consistent movement. 9 hard drives, multiple computers, storage devices hidden throughout the house, almost all of it encrypted. Hours passed, then deep into the search came a breakthrough. Taped inside a series of American history books were photographic negatives. Images of abuse, not Adam, but a teenage boy. Proof that this behaviour stretched beyond one child, beyond one period of time. Fingerprints lifted from those negatives would later be linked directly to Peter Truong, and that was enough. For Task Force Argos, suspicion had hardened into certainty. A call was made to the US authorities because Truong and Newton were no longer just suspects overseas. They were 2 men travelling with a child, and the clock was now ticking. In the US, everything moved quickly. Surveillance teams were put in place and Truong and Newton were located within hours. They were staying about an hour outside of LA in Lakewood, California, with Mark Newton's aunt directly across the road from a school. When police moved in, Truong and Newton were handcuffed and taken in for questioning. There were no emotional outbursts, no explanations, just denial. They invoked their right to remain silent and refused to engage. The image that they had curated for years, calm, controlled, respectable, stayed intact. But Adam wasn't there. Instead, he was already on the move. A friend of Truong and Newton was driving him towards Santa Monica Pier. In downtown LA, police set up a roadblock. The car was stopped and Adam was finally separated from the people who had controlled his life since infancy. When officers first spoke with him, what they encountered was not a child who felt safe to speak. On some questions, Adam shut down completely. He avoided eye contact. He withdrew into himself. When asked about the people in his life, about his parents, about whether anything had happened to him, he became visibly distressed. At one point, he made it clear why. He didn't want to get them in trouble. That response didn't come out of nowhere. Adam had been trained. Truong and Newton had rehearsed him using mock forensic interviews, teaching him what to say, what not to say, and how to remain silent.
How old was he?
5 or 6 maybe. Despite the suspicions, despite the intelligence, despite the patterns that now spanned continents, police did not have direct evidence that Adam was being abused. There were no charges they could lay, no statement that they could rely on. Legally, there was only one option, and that was to release Peter Truong and Mark Newton.
Is all the stuff that they found in their house not enough?
Their priority is to protect Adam, and what they need to do is charge them with something that's not going to allow him to go back into their care.
Is not having all of that stuff, those photos and those videos, is that not enough?
So you have to remember that the US is still not aware that the photos that their investigation have are Adam. They still haven't made that link.
Yeah, but these men own photos of other people in their house.
Yes, but there is no way to prove that they took the photos. Like, yes, he has his fingerprint is on that negative, but there's no way to say that he was there, that he abused that child.
But he has hold of it.
He
has it.
Yeah.
Is that not enough?
But that is only going to put Peter Truong in jail. It's not going to put Mark Newton in jail, and then that means their child is returned to them. So
it's not enough.
It's not
disgusting.
Yeah. They probably could have stuck some lower charge that, you know, and I think that gets done from time to time to bide them a bit of time. But I think they realised that what they were going for here was there had to be no way that it could fail. Like if you just kind of put something that you're not sure you're going to be able to prove and then it goes to court and that person's found not guilty, then you've gone through that whole process for nothing. So I think they were looking for the smoking gun, and it did come. For the child who had just been removed from their care, the danger wasn't over yet, and for investigators, the hardest part of this case was only just beginning. Back in Australia, Task Force Argos began working with grim precision. If the answers weren't coming from the interviews, they would have to come from the evidence. Detective John Roos and his team started at the beginning methodically reviewing everything seized from the Cairns house. Every photograph, every video, every fragment of digital life that the men had left behind. Inside the victim identification unit, Paul Griffiths focused on the only hard drive that they could access, the single device that was not encrypted. What emerged was a visual timeline stretching back to 2004, a life mapped almost entirely through travel, 30 countries in 6 years. Adam present throughout, always photographed, always documented, surrounded by unidentified adult men in different places, different hotel rooms in different cities. At first, the people in the images were strangers, but patterns began to form as investigators slowed everything down, replaying audio, analysing backgrounds, identifying locations frame by frame. And yet, despite the volume, there was nothing overtly illegal on that accessible drive. No images that crossed the legal threshold. No single piece of evidence that would justify immediate action. Forensic analyst Leo Zawinski was trying to break into 6 encrypted hard drives. Passwords were tested relentlessly, names, numbers, variations, and nothing opened. And all the while the reality loomed that without that evidence, Adam could be returned to the people who had controlled him his entire life. Then one detail rose above the rest. Among the most recent material, dated April 2011, were videos and photos from the US. Adam receiving a henna tattoo during an outing in North Carolina. Footage from a few days later showed Adam in San Francisco playing in a hotel room while Truong filmed him, the tattoo already beginning to fade. At the time, Task Force Argos didn't realise what they were seeing. The evidence they needed was there, but they didn't yet know how to read it. Thousands of kilometres away inside the US Department of Justice in Washington, Inspector Brian Bone was focused on dismantling Tail of the Dragon. As he walked into his office, he overheard a conference call, an Australian investigation, a young boy, suspected abuse. Bone asked to see those images. The moment they appeared on his screen, everything snapped into place. It was the same child. The boy investigators in the US had been desperately trying to identify, the one seen in the videos with John Rex Powell and Jason Beto matched perfectly. The same mole on his stomach, the same henna tattoo on his chest. A detail so specific it erased all doubt. 2 investigations running independently across continents had just collided. For Task Force Argos, it was overwhelming, relief, horror, vindication, every emotion all at once. The final piece had finally fallen into place. In February 2012, Peter Truong and Mark Newton were arrested and transferred to Indiana to face prosecution. Both pleaded guilty. And once separated from his partner and cut off from the network that had protected him for years, Peter Truong made the decision to expose just how vast the damage was. Facing the possibility of life in prison, he began to talk. More than that, he handed over the passwords. The encrypted drives were finally opened, revealing a hidden world investigators had only glimpsed before. Inside were pathways to other offenders, other victims, other crimes. What Truong gave police didn't undo what had already happened, but it allowed them to stop more children from disappearing into the same darkness. The network had been breached, and it would never be the same again. I'm going to link a documentary in the show notes. There's another part to this story, and I've chosen not to share it here because I don't want to minimise the damage that this man did in any way. Do I appreciate that he handed those passwords over? Yeah. But it was the bare fucking minimum of what he could have and should have done. We talk about how I try to look at things openly and without judgment, and I was able to do that when I watched this documentary. But I can't tie the two together. I will link it in the show notes and people can go and watch it themselves. Truong shares a story about his own childhood, and it's horrific, and it might give some explanation around why he did the things that he did, but I'm not going to make excuses for this man. So if that's something that you feel like you want to look at, you're most welcome. But I just can't put the two together. So I've made the choice not to. Assistant US Attorney Steve Batola reviewed the evidence in its entirety. What he was faced with was not a series of incidents, but a sustained pattern of abuse that began when Adam was around 20 months old and continued for years. There was no ambiguity in what the material showed. This was deliberate, repeated harm, documented relentlessly. DeBroda watched more than 80 hours of footage of Adam being abused. In just 1 month alone, when Adam was 5 years old, Mark Newton filmed himself abusing his son on more than 12 separate occasions. Adam was also filmed with multiple other men in different countries, encounters organised and facilitated by both Newton and Truong. One moment stood out for what it revealed about the control. In a recording, Newton's voice can be heard correcting Adam, not because he was in danger, but because he wanted to play instead of complying with what an adult was demanding of him. Adam's instinct to play was treated as disobedience. The abuse itself was treated as expectation. By the end of the investigation, at least 8 men had been identified as having abused Adam. All of it arranged by Truong and Newton. Often the men involved paid for flights and accommodation, not as payment in a traditional sense, but as part of an exchange built on access, status, and shared ideology. Adam was not trafficked for profit. He was trafficked because the people around him wanted him to be. In December 2013, Peter Truong was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. Mark Newton received an even longer sentence, 40 years, reflecting both the scale of his direct abuse and his role in orchestrating Adam's exploitation. What happened to Adam after sentencing is deliberately limited in the public record. After Peter Truong and Mark Newton were arrested and ultimately sentenced, Adam was removed permanently from their care and placed under child protection. From that point on, authorities made a very conscious decision to close the door on public information about his life. His real name has never been released. His location has never been disclosed, and no identifying details have ever been made public beyond what was strictly necessary for the prosecution. At the centre of all of this, beyond the investigations, the courtrooms, the sentencing, is Adam, a child whose real name we will never know, whose life is now protected by that anonymity. What justice could do was remove him from harm, dismantle the network that exploited him, and ensure the people who betrayed him can never reach him again. What it cannot do is give him back the years that were taken. So the most important thing that happened after sentencing is also the quietest. Adam was given the chance to live a life that is not defined by what was done to him. His story does not belong to the public. It belongs to him. And in respecting that silence, we honour the one person in this case who never had a choice. Next week on What Would They Say, we are joined by Kat McKay, a victim advocate, coach and author whose work focuses on support and understanding. In our conversation, Kat speaks from her own lived experience, helping us to better understand how trust is manipulated, how harm is hidden in plain sight, and what it can take to begin rebuilding safety after it has been broken. If listening to this story has brought anything up for you, please go gently with yourself. I want you to know that it is okay to reach out to others. You don't have to carry the heaviness of this on your own. Free support is available in Australia 24/7 through 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732 or Lifeline on 13 11 14. Our international listeners can find support services in their area via the No More Global Directory at nomoredirectory.org. Take care of yourselves. Please be kind to yourself. I know that this has been a lot, and we will see you next week.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If These Trees Could Talk and What Would They Say are productions of Bellevue Studio. Our host is Shannon Walters, executive and audio production by Megan Anderson, with socials and marketing managed by Mia Oberdorf. We always appreciate hearing your thoughts, so if you would like to support the show, you can rate, review and subscribe. To stay up to date between episodes, you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok. For more information on this episode or to connect with our guests, you'll find everything you need to know in the show notes at ifthesetreescouldtalk.com.au. We're grateful to have you with us, and we look forward to sharing what comes next. Thanks for being here.